On this vote, the yeas are 228 and the nays are 188. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized. The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 225 and the nays are 190. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to House Resolution 445 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 3055. Will the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, kindly take the chair?
The Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 3055, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Departments of Commerce and Justice, Science, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on Monday, June 24, 2019, Amendment number 244, printed in the House Report 116 through 119, offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, had been disposed of. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 116 through 119, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 251 by Mr. Banks of Indiana. Amendment number 268 by Ms. Jayapal of Washington. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote in the series. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on Amendment number 251, printed in Part B of House Report 116 through 119, offered by the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 251, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-119, offered by Mr. Banks of Indiana.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those who support a requested recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. On this, the yeas are 131, the nays are 287. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on amendment number 268, printed in Part B of House Report 116 through 119, offered by the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 268, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-119, offered by Ms. Jayapal of Washington.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 2-minute vote. On this, the yeas are 294, the nays are 127. The amendment is adopted. There being no further amendments under the rule, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee on the Whole House on the State of the Union is under consideration H.R. 3055, and pursuant to House Resolution 445, and report the bill is amended by that resolution back to the House with sundry further amendments adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
Thank you, boss. The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 3055 and pursuant to House Resolution 445 reports the bill, as amended pursuant to that resolution, back to the House with sundry further amendments adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Pursuant to House Resolution 445, the question on adoption of the further amendments will be put in gross. The question is on the adoption of the amendments. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendments are adopted. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill making appropriations for the Departments of Commerce and Justice, Science, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
The House will be in order. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Hurd of Texas moves to recommit the bill H.R. 3055 to the Committee on Appropriations with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. Page 7, line 12, after the dollar amount, insert reduced by $75 million. Page 25, line 7, after the first dollar amount, insert increase by $75 million.
The gentleman. The House will be in order. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues know I'm the only Republican on the border. My colleagues know I'm the only member of Congress that has 820 miles along the border. My colleagues know that I've spent a good deal of my time up here working with them on things like stopping the separation of families along the border. My colleagues also know that some of y'all are not for open borders. It is an understatement to say that our nation's immigration docket is a matter of concern. The caseload has increased by nearly five-fold since the end of 2008. Now it stands roughly at 9,000 cases. The average wait for non-detained individuals is over 670 days, with many individuals waiting much longer for an immigration hearing. The net effect of this untenable backlog situation is to delay justice, in many cases for years, for those with valid claims. This is simply outrageous. The adjudication of immigration matters is essential to the proper administration of justice in our country. Congress must ensure the U.S. immigration laws are administered fairly, efficiently, and consistent with due process. This motion adds $75 million to our immigration court system. It will support additional immigration judge teams and the expansion of courtroom capacity. Now, some of my colleagues will say there are already judges in this bill. They meet the requests of actually this White House. But that is not enough. In 2016, ACLU came out and said that to get back with the backlog there, to address the backlog then, which was only 500,000, we needed 500 immigration judge teams. We need more. Many of y'all have already voted for more than this when y'all helped me jam Republican leadership last year, or try to jam Republican leadership last year on sorting out the immigration issue. Now, some of my colleagues will say taking money away from census to do that is not the right way to go. This underlying bill funds the census 40% above the president's request. That's more than $2.3 billion. This bill includes $8 billion with or without this amendment. And most importantly, this motion to recommit does not address or change the question that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have addressed in this bill, and that's whether or not the citizenship question can be added on the 2020 census. This bill says it cannot. This motion to recommit does not change that. Let me repeat. This motion to recommit does not change that. We are taking money out of the Census Reserve Slush Fund. This is money that may or may not be used. We can hold on to this funding for unforeseen problems, or we can use this funding now to help solve a problem we see loud and clear. Our current shortage of immigration judges delays justice for individuals who have valid immigration claims while preserving many years of continued illegal presence for others who do not. Worse still, the allure of our weakened system entices migrants to undertake the incredibly dangerous journey north with young children. I urge a yes vote on this motion to help reverse these regrettable and unsustainable trends caused by our broken immigration system. And Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion. The motion to recommit.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion. With the approach of the 2020 census, the U.S. Census Bureau needs a strong infusion of resources to ensure a thorough and accurate count. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, my colleague knows that the funding level provided from the Census Bureau in this bill is more in line with recent revised budget costs and estimates. This bill also supports critical funding of the Bureau as it embarks on the most technologically advanced census in its history, including $1 billion in infrastructure that includes IT funding to enhance the Bureau's cybersecurity efforts and protect respondents' personal data and information submitted to the Bureau. Every dollar can be tied to an original plan, a cost estimate, or a recommendation submitted by the department. There appears to be a growing attack on the census out of fear of demographically changing country and a concerning effort by the other side to skew results in their favor. We need every dollar in this census because the administration is fear-mongering, because they are trying to force an undercount with the inclusion of the citizenship question, and in reality, we are recommending a funding level consistent with what they indicated they need for a fair and accurate count. Any proposal to decrease this amount increases the risk of undercounts of minority and hard-to-count communities, including rural parts of this country that lack broadband services. Such an undercount would cause these areas to lose out on political representation and federal funding. Reduced funding for the census also increases the risk to cyber intrusion and the release of personal protected data. This bill already provides a strong increase for immigration judges, as the gentleman mentioned, consistent with the administration's request, an increase of over $110 million over the fiscal year FY19 level, which provides for 100 additional judge teams, which my colleague acknowledged in his remarks. I'm not aware of a census slush fund, but I am aware that these are vital resources that will help count our communities, help ensure that this is done fairly, and help ensure that hard-to-count communities are counted. The Justice Department is not able to hire any faster than that, as the gentleman acknowledged. I urge rejection of this motion, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. With that, I yield back.
Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it. The motion is not adopted.
Mr. Speaker,
The gentleman from Texas is
I
recognized.
request a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 2 of Rule 20, this is a 5-minute vote on the motion to recommit. Will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the passage of the bill. This is a 5-minute vote.
The yeas are 201. The nays are 220. The motion is not adopted. The question is on the passage of the bill. Pursuant to Clause 10 of Rule 20, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 227, the yeas are 194. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker,
The Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations will now come to order. The Subcommittee on Oversight Investigations is meeting today to hear testimony on chronic wasting disease, the threats to wildlife, public lands, hunting, and health. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good afternoon and welcome to the Oversight Investigations Subcommittee hearing on chronic wasting disease, the threats to wildlife, public lands, hunting, and health. Once again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for giving their time and resources to be here today so we can better understand this important issue. The last time this committee held a hearing on chronic wasting disease was in 2002, some 7 years ago. And at that time, the disease had only been detected in 5 states in the U.S., but 17 years later, chronic wasting disease has been spread to a total of 26 states, as you can see on the map behind me. And for those of you not yet familiar, chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a highly contagious and deadly disease that infects deer, elk, moose, and reindeer, a group of animals referred to collectively as cervids. And this disease degrades the infected animal's neurological system, frequently leaving large holes in the brain. There aren't obvious symptoms for a year or two after infection, but when they do begin, they often show up as excessive drooling, drastic weight loss, and unquenchable thirst. The animal stumbles, can't coordinate its limbs, and loses its fear of people and its energy until the body eventually shuts down. Unlike many diseases, and most diseases we're familiar with, however, the culprit behind CWD is not a virus or bacteria. It's a small protein called a prion that is found mostly in the brain. Unfortunately, there's still a lot we don't know about prions, and that's what makes this disease so difficult to manage. There's no vaccine, no cure, and no treatment. Once an animal gets the disease, there's no turning back. The rate of death is 100%. And chronic wasting disease is not the first time we've seen prion disease. Several years ago, the mad cow disease outbreak, which was responsible for over 230 human deaths, was caused by a prion. In that case, the disease was able to jump the species barrier from cows to humans when people ate meat that had been contaminated. If a person contracted mad cow disease, it was 100% fatal as well. And to try to get rid of the disease, the UK had to oversee the slaughter and disposal of nearly 4.5 million cattle, costing the beef industry and the economy billions of dollars. Fortunately, we don't yet know of any cases in which CWD has crossed the species barrier to humans. But experts in the scientific community, one of which we'll hear from today, have concerns that it will very well could. And in fact, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommends that people don't eat meat that has been infected with chronic wasting disease. Despite that warning, the Washington Post has recently reported a couple weeks ago that up to 15,000 CWD-infected deer are estimated to have been consumed each year. And this could translate into more than 100,000 meals of tainted meat consumed annually. For the hunting community, which is largely dependent on a healthy deer and elk population, chronic wasting disease is an important, if not the most important, issue affecting them today. One of our witnesses will offer his perspective on just how much the disease is impacting both the deer hunting and conservation as a whole. At this point, the most effective strategy we have for managing CWD is preventing the disease from spreading even further. State wildlife agencies are on the front lines of the fight against the disease, but without additional research and funding, their options are limited. Even states without known cases of CWD, like my home state of California, must be prepared to manage the spread of this disease. And today we're going to hear from 2 different states that have been working to contain it, but they still face many challenges along the way. There is no question that CWD is an issue that affects us all. Fully addressing CWD requires a bipartisan effort, so I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for joining me in highlighting this issue and exploring ways and areas in which we can make some headway in slowing the momentum of this disease down. It's my hope that we will continue to work together and seek solutions for fighting this disease. Our health, our wildlife, the hunting community, and our economy depend on it. And with that, I will now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity today to examine chronic wasting disease, or CWD, and the actions being taken at the state and federal levels to better understand the disease and contain its spread. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. G.T. Thompson, be allowed to sit in on the dais and participate in today's hearing.
No objection.
CWD is a difficult disease to manage, and its spread is mostly present in the United States and Canada. Some studies reflect that protein agents in infected animals that transmit the disease through bodily fluids can survive in the environment for years after the host animal has died. The proportion of CWD-infected animals is increasing in areas where the disease is already established, with some areas reporting significant percentages of adult male population infected. Looking specifically to this committee's jurisdiction, CWD-positive deer are found in counties with federally owned lands in 23 states across the country. However, there is a lot of misinformation and alarmism surrounding CWD. As we move forward, I think it's important to first accurately define the scale of the threat posed by the spread of the disease and identify the most effective means of halting CWD spread. Unfortunately, some advocacy groups have used the growing public awareness of CWD to advance a divisive and anti-hunting agenda that can generate distinct distrust between wildlife officials and hunters. CWD has never been transmitted to humans, and no reputably published medical research suggests that transmission is possible. Nevertheless, CWD is cause for concern. CWD reduces the population of animals it affects. The fear of potential human infection, even in the absence of scientific evidence, has caused anxiety for hunters and decreases their willingness to hunt in areas where CWD has been identified. Similarly, there is a widespread, but again scientifically unproven, concern that consuming meat from an animal infected with CWD could be harmful. While the few studies conducted on the economic impact of CWD have reached mixed conclusions, the sportsman's community is understandably worried about the long-term impacts of CWD. For many of my constituents, deer hunting is a beloved family tradition and an important part of our community's local culture and history, while also filling many freezers with meat without regard for wealth or poverty of the hunter. To date, the federal response to CWD appears to suffer from minimal coordination between the Department of Interior's U.S. Geological Survey and the Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services. Before committing significant taxpayer resources, federal agencies need to fully understand the existing body of CWD research, the current science-based best management practices, and to closely examine the work already being done by the state wildlife officials. I believe that there is a general bipartisan support for further research on mechanics of CWD transmission, on improving early detection, and on finding more effective means of arresting the spread of CWD. I hope that this hearing will be an opportunity for the members to hear from a variety of experts on the front line of combating CWD and will move us towards developing a more effective and robust response to the spread of CWD. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you so much, and we have the experts here today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Christian Schuler is a wildlife disease ecologist at Cornell University's Wildlife Health Lab. Mr. Jason Summers is Chief of the Resource Science Division at the Missouri Department of Conservation. Mr. Carter Smith is the Executive Director of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Mr. Nick Pinhasohto is the President and CEO of the National Deer Alliance. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there's 1 minute left, and then red when time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. And with that, The chair will now recognize Dr. Christian Schuler.
Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gomert, members of the subcommittee, thank you for calling this hearing and inviting me to testify on chronic wasting disease, or CWD, which I believe to be the most serious threat facing wild deer and elk populations in North America today. I've been studying CWD intensively for nearly 2 decades and am currently the wildlife disease ecologist for the New York State Wildlife Health Program. Since my start in 2002, I have watched CWD spread from 8 to 26 states, and prevalence rates exponentially increase to well over 50% in some areas. We do not know what the end point will be. Once CWD becomes established in a population, it is nearly impossible to eradicate. Therefore, it is critical that we follow the precautionary principle when dealing with CWD and take preventative action in the face of uncertainty. In addition to the 26 states, CWD has been discovered in 4 Canadian provinces and 4 other countries: South Korea, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. New York is the only state to have been able to eliminate CWD in wild deer and remain CWD-free 14 years later. There has been no subsequent detections in more than 50,000 tests. Rather than drop its guard, New York has maintained an aggressive stance towards CWD and continues to serve as a model for programs in other states. We do not have a long history with CWD since the disease was not detected in wild cervids until 1978. Its presence in wild animals makes it unique and exceedingly difficult to study. It affects all native North American cervid species. An animal may be infected for a year or more before appearing to be sick. Transmission is very efficient and can occur from animal to animal or from contaminated environments that have been infected with saliva, feces, urine, blood, or carcasses. Infected animals are more likely to be killed by a hunter, predator, or vehicle. Male white-tailed deer are 3 times more likely to be infected than females. Studies in Wyoming have showed that heavily infected white-tailed deer populations declined by 10% annually, while mule deer populations decreased at 21%. Elk populations may begin to decline when prevalence reaches 13%. CWD is in the family of universally fatal diseases known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, caused by a misfolded protein called a prion. A prion is not a bacteria or virus. There are no treatments available, and antibiotics are not effective on prions. There have not been any successful vaccine trials in cervids, and deer and elk show no true genetic resistance, and now we're starting to see different strains of prions. Although there are no known cases of CWD in humans, there is considerable concern that prions are capable of adapting to their host and could someday infect humans. The Center for Disease Control recommends that no one knowingly consume CWD-positive venison. A study is currently underway that found macaques developed disease after being infected brain and skeletal muscle from CWD-positive deer. The CDC recommends that anyone hunting in a CWD area have their animal tested before consumption. It is the similarity between CWD and bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease, that is most concerning. Over 4.5 million cows were killed in the United Kingdom, and 231 people died after eating infected beef. CWD prions can also be taken up into plant tissues. Crops testing positive thus far include alfalfa, wheat, corn, and tomatoes, which presents a potential route of prion exposure for wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. Additionally, there is concern that other countries may ban export of crops from areas with CWD. Prions are one of the most resilient pathogens known. They are very resistant to high heat and harsh chemicals. Prions will bind to soil particles and remain in the environment for up to 16 years. Given the disease's wildlife perpetuation and environmental contamination, CWD is likely not eradicatable. It is, however, preventable and manageable. Large sections of the country have not encountered CWD yet and can take steps to keep prions out. The biggest risk for spreading prions is via movement of subclinically infected live cervids and their parts or products. At its core, CWD erodes our public trust resources. Any meaningful strategies and science to combat CWD will require long-term approaches with sustained state and federal efforts. Future needs include sustained fiscal support for state and federal wildlife agencies, as well as veterinary and wildlife diagnostic labs, research funds to work toward new breakthroughs, and improved support from stakeholders up through their elected officials to raise this disease to a national level of prominence and make it a top priority. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schuler. And with that, the chair will now recognize Mr. Jason Sumners.
Thank you, Chairman Cox. Whitetail deer is arguably the most important game. Annually, nearly 500,000 individuals and more than $700 million pursuing whitetail deer in Missouri. Chronic wasting disease is a serious threat to our deer herd and one of the most significant challenges facing state fish and wildlife agencies. Most agencies, it's not a matter of if, but when you detect chronic wasting disease. For Missouri, that day occurred in late February 2010 when a CWD positive deer was detected in a confined cervid facility in Macon County. In the fall of 2011, our first free-ranging deer was detected in Macon County as well. Since that time, several additional scattered areas of infection have been detected. Most of these detections have been small geographic distribution and relatively low prevalence, which indicates that CWD has been repeatedly introduced into new areas of the state. Once established in a population, direct treatment interventions are limited because there is no known cure or vaccine. The only tested management strategy that can limit the spread of chronic wasting disease is localized targeted removals of infected deer. But this method may only be practical or impactful when the levels of infection is relatively limited. Therefore, we have invested substantial effort in localized targeted culling to have a meaningful impact on the geographic spread and prevalence of the disease in Missouri. Elimination of CWD is unlikely in most scenarios, but even without elimination, there is significant value in limiting the number of infected animals on the landscape. Limiting the amount of CWD in the population can help minimize population-level impacts over time, but also allow for future interventions as science advances and new tools for management become available. Many folks have called this buy time and pay for science. Ultimately, chronic wasting disease management will require a long-term adaptive approach, which patience and persistence will be essential. Additionally, like many states in the East, 93% of Missouri is in private ownership. Because of this, support and cooperation from private landowners, hunters, and the public are critical in ensuring our ability to manage this disease. We know that doing nothing is not an option. In a 2017 postseason survey of Missouri deer hunters, we found that 74% agreed chronic wasting disease was a significant risk to the Missouri deer herd. Additionally, continued participation and support for localized management efforts indicate, again, continued support for our aggressive management actions. We also know that increasing prevalence can affect hunter behavior. In fact, growing human health concerns with chronic wasting disease has resulted in increased expectations by hunters. Primarily, the expectation of providing testing prior to consumption of deer is now asked by many hunters. Additionally, they expect the response of those test results within days, not weeks or months. Any CWD-related regulation or management action is likely to result in some pretty strong opposition or criticism of the agency. Therefore, effective education, clear communication are critical in maintaining support for our management efforts. We've utilized many different communication techniques aimed at maintaining credibility in managing the disease and clearly articulating management goals to the public, hunters, and local landowners. The cost of state agencies is significant. CWD management is extremely taxing on a state agency. Since 2012, MDC has spent $9 million and 350,000 staff hours on CWD surveillance management and outreach efforts. Over the last 3 years, we've had a all-hands-on-deck approach involving more than 800 of our staff on opening weekend of the firearms season. This all comes at a serious cost to other important conservation work. The cost of habitat management and restoration projects, working with local landowners, management and restoration of other species, including threatened and endangered animals, public outreach and education programs that are not conducted, conservation-related activities that are of great interest to the public and benefit fish, forest, and wildlife. In 2011, federal funding provided through APHIS to support surveillance activities was eliminated. As a result of this long-term monitoring efforts, we have less knowledge of the broad geographic distribution and prevalence of the disease. This issue is of great concern for us in Missouri because of the expansion of the disease across Kansas, Arkansas, and into Missouri. Efforts like the best management practices at AFWA are certainly helpful, but not enough. We must do more. In closing, states have the responsibility to ensure the health of deer and elk populations and carry the burden of managing these. We're asking for assistance from those federal agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sumners. And the chair will now recognize Mr. Carter Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gohmert, members of the committee. I appreciate the chance to offer a few words today on the Texas history and perspective on the management of this disease. I guess as a point of departure, let me offer this. When it comes to wildlife in Texas, deer are the proverbial goose that laid the golden egg. Not only are they our most populous big game animal, they are our most popular big game animal. We have roughly 1,100,000 hunters, and roughly 80% of those are deer hunters. Deer are also a major economic driver, particularly in our rural communities, where those very same 1 million plus hunters infuse upwards of $2 billion a year in purchases of supplies and equipment in rural communities across our state. Candidly, that pales in comparison to the fact that they're the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar ranching, hunting, wildlife, and rural real estate-based economy that is predicated on the health of those deer herds. And that issue is particularly germane in our state because we are 95% privately owned, and so any successful conservation measure, including a disease prevention measure, has to involve the collaboration and support of the private landowner community. Those very same landowners in our state, as we know from our very extensive experience with them, are keenly interested in deer and deer management. So it's really against this backdrop that we first discovered chronic wasting disease in our state in far west Texas, outside of El Paso, in an isolated mountain range near the New Mexico border in 2012. Not surprisingly, our response was to increase our sampling intensity across the state to try to ascertain the geographic distribution of the disease, but also the prevalence. Today, we have found chronic wasting disease in 3 isolated locations in our state. The original location where we discovered it. We have found it in free-range mule deer and elk and white-tailed deer in the Panhandle near the New Mexico border, and also in a series of large captive breeding facilities in central Texas just west of San Antonio. Not surprisingly, our management efforts have been heavily oriented to containing the disease within these 3 geographic areas. We are guided by a CWD management plan that we produce and implement in very close concert with our sister agency and partner, the Texas Animal Health Commission, which are the state veterinarians and animal disease specialists. And our plan is really guided by 3 very important pillars. First, to minimize the risk of this disease to free-range and captive white-tailed mule deer and elk and other susceptible species in Texas. Secondly, establish and maintain support for reasonable and prudent CWD management with our hunter and landowner partners. And certainly last but not least, minimize the direct and indirect impacts of this disease to our hunting heritage and our hunting and outdoor-based economies. 2 things here that I want to come back and emphasize. First is the criticality of maintaining the confidence and trust of private landowners. That is absolutely paramount. And so we have been very fortunate to have the support of the state's leading landowner organization in this effort, the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers and the Texas Wildlife Association. Second, of course, is making sure that we're looking at the management of this risk across all possible places and vectors. We're looking at the totality of the landscape, and so we're focused not only on and in deer and free-range settings, but also in captive cervid communities as well, not only in our native deer, but also exotic susceptible species, and we think that's very important. As Dr. Schuler suggested, we have followed the very precautionary disease management principles in addressing this disease, focused again on early detection and rapid containment, and have implemented measures such as increasing our surveillance 5-fold across the state and trying to address the areas where the greatest threats lie. And those are primarily in the areas of the movement of live deer and prohibiting that movement from infected areas or high-risk areas, or the movement of hunter-harvested carcasses from those areas. We have seen our expenditure in the management of this disease increase roughly 7-fold since the original discovery in our state. The disease is a transboundary one, and so there are opportunities for additional national support and emphasis that lie in the area of much more coordinated and focused research in the areas of transmissibility, helping to invest in new testing, evaluating the success of various adaptive management strategies across our state, and we're certainly in need of a more coordinated public awareness campaign to help engage our hunters. We look forward to working with the committee to address this very significant issue to our state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. The chair will now recognize Mr. Nick Pinhasohto.
My name is Nick Pinhasohto. I'm the president and CEO of the National Deer Alliance. We work on issues that impact all North American deer species, but I would estimate that nearly 90% of all of our work now is focused on chronic wasting disease. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, which is one of the strongest deer hunting traditions in the country. I was telling deer hunting stories long before I was even old enough to hunt, and some of the best memories of my life are of my dad and uncle returning home from a hunt and sharing their adventures. By the time I was old enough to hunt with them, I couldn't imagine life getting any better. If somebody shot a deer in our neighborhood, everybody would gather around to see it and then share in the story behind it. Everyone I knew hunted, both boys and girls, and I just assumed that was the case for the entire country, but eventually I would learn that only about 5% of Americans hunt. But that remains enough hunters to implement the North American model of wildlife conservation, which has proven to be the most effective and efficient way to manage wildlife. Unfortunately, the continued prevalence and spread of chronic wasting disease across the country is not only threatening our deer hunting traditions, but the entire sphere of wildlife management and conservation. Now, like deer hunters in the 26 states that have CWD within their borders, my family hunting traditions will be forever altered. In fact, the land where I shot my first buck when I was 14 years old lies on the border of a designated CWD management area. But now is not the time to be selfish and worry about our deer or our own personal experience. Instead, it's time for hunters to be leaders and to do their part to see that the needs of deer are met first. The rules have changed, and the definition of a quality deer shall now be defined as a healthy deer. CWD is creating significant challenges for the future of deer hunting and broad wildlife conservation. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's most recent survey of 2016, approximately 80% of all hunters pursue big game, and 70% hunt deer specifically. Deer hunting alone generates nearly $40 billion to the U.S. economy each year, and more than $27 billion generated from deer hunting-related expenditures, more than half of that, deer account for more than half of that. State wildlife agencies are primarily funded by the sale of hunting licenses and revenue generated from the Pittman-Robertson Act. Therefore, deer hunters are carrying the financial burden for all wildlife management. From 2011 to 2016, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reports that big game hunting participation dropped by nearly 20%, and there is little doubt that CWD has impacted the decision of many to quit hunting deer. From an industry perspective, over that same time period, hunting-related expenditures were reported to have dropped nearly 30%. Every time a deer hunter hangs up his or her rifle or bow for the last time, the negative impact is felt by all wildlife. Death by CWD often happens slowly, and most infected deer look and act normally until close to the very end. The disease does not kill in large numbers and at the same time, and it's not a process that's easily observable. When hunters cannot see the problem, it's easy to understand why it's hard for them to believe that there is one. Communication with hunters about the urgency of the issue is complicated. Hunters are easily susceptible to affinity bias. They believe the people that deliver the news that they want to hear, and some have made it, unfortunately, their platform to suggest that chronic wasting disease is not a problem. They direct insults at wildlife professionals, which only intensifies the lack of trust hunters have for state wildlife agencies, creating an us-against-them mentality. Science clearly shows that CWD is a very real problem for deer and ultimately other wildlife. It's also a very real problem for hunters. Despite this, groups of hunters in some states have formed coalitions to stop state wildlife agencies from trying to slow the disease that threatens the very traditions that they hold dearly. It is imperative that we bridge the widening gap between the biological science and the political and social science. Most deer hunters are extremely passionate about the sport and equally passionate about making sure that there are healthy deer herds to pursue, but these passions have become conflicted due to the spread of CWD. Wildlife managers need help with the costs of monitoring, research, and educating hunters. Hunters want answers to their questions and understand that what they may be asked to do for the greater good will have a positive impact. Leadership is required from all fronts, even outside of the hunting and conservation community, to give us the best chance to find the most effective approaches to managing the disease. In summary, CWD is an unprecedented threat to to healthy deer herds, our hunting traditions, and the North American model of wildlife conservation. It is continuing to spread across the country and is now confirmed to exist in more than half of our states. Hunters, particularly those that pursue big game, generate the bulk of the funding that is used for the management of all wildlife. A further decline in hunters is a losing proposition, as hunters will play an important role in managing the disease. It is unrealistic to think that CWD is going away anytime soon. We need to come to grips with the idea that this is a forever issue and that there is no clear end in sight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all the witnesses for your valuable testimony. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. I'd like to now recognize myself for the first 5. And Dr. Schuler, thanks so much for being here. And naturally, with any disease, it's important to have accurate information about the science so we know what the risks are for both wildlife and for ourselves. And as has been mentioned already today, there's a lot of comparisons made between chronic wasting disease and mad cow disease, since both diseases fall under the unique category of prion diseases. And of course, probably the number one concern for all of us is with these two diseases is that with mad cow disease, it was able to jump the species barrier from cows to humans when people ate meat that was infected. And once humans contracted it, there was absolutely no treatment or cure. And so, of course, there are a lot of questions and concerns about whether or not chronic wasting disease can do the same thing. And what is the risk of chronic wasting disease being able to jump the species barrier into humans?
Well, we've had to look at a lot of other transmissible spongiform encephalopathy research to answer that. And there's been different studies looking at epidemiological factors. There's been studies looking at genetic susceptibility and also routes of exposure. So in gathering all this information together with the BSE outbreak in Europe, there were approximately, they estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of over 100,000 cows that entered the food chain that were infected with BSE. And we know that over 200 people developed variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which was the form of BSE in humans. We have not seen anything like that in humans thus far with CWD, but as you mentioned, it is in the same family of diseases and therefore a risk. There is currently a study underway looking at macaques, and that study is still in process, where they ate skeletal muscle tissue and did develop disease. This is in contrast to a previous study of macaques where they were fed similar skeletal muscle tissue and did not develop disease. With the other TSE that we compare to CWD frequently, which is scrapie in sheep, that has been known for several centuries, and there's been no known cases of scrapie in sheep. So we have evidence on both sides that yes, it can jump the species barrier, and no, it can't. So at this point, I characterize the risk as more than zero. So it's definitely a potential, but we don't know how great a potential. And it also is likely to depend on the human genotype and their susceptibility to prion diseases. Even with BSE, there were very few people that actually developed disease. So having that potentially non-zero risk, it's almost the perceived risk of developing disease that concerns me quite a bit, that people will be worried about it and therefore may change their behaviors. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done in this area. The National Prion Research Center in Ohio is doing most of this work in the United States. So right now we've got evidence on both sides, so we can't say that the risk is zero, but I can't tell you what the upper number is.
No, thanks very much. And outside of the National Prion Research Center, where's some of that other research being conducted? And I think Mr. Summers was saying that the funding was cut recently. And how is most of that research being funded?
So the funding related to human susceptibility is often through NIH or NSF funding. I believe Mr. Sumner was referring to the USDA funding that was going to states, and that funding ended in fiscal year 2011, where states were appropriated money to help with their surveillance efforts through USDA.
And Mr. Summers, can you comment on that, that cut to funding, and how's that affected?
Yeah, so correct. The loss of funding for state fish and wildlife agencies in 2011 really impacted their state's ability to continue monitoring, and it impacts our understanding of where the disease is currently located today. And I think it's partially the result. The result of that is the recent findings, for example, in Tennessee and in Arkansas, where it's now been detected with broad geographic distribution and pretty high prevalence, because for the last 8 years, states have not had that additional funding to support testing.
Thank you so much. Just about out of time, so the chair will now recognize Ranking Member Gohmert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all the witnesses being here, especially our fellow Texan, Mr. Smith. Of course, you understand why this committee's jurisdiction is primarily based on federally owned land. To combat CWD will require support and cooperation of private landowners. But as you know, Texas doesn't have a substantial amount of federally owned land. We do have some national forests in my district. But I'd like to ask Mr. Smith, how have you facilitated cooperation among the local landowners in Texas?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question, Congressman, and that's critical to our work on this issue. Simply, we can't engage in any kind of successful wildlife-based issue in our state without the cooperation and support of our landowner community. And so we have multiple advisory committees that advise our agency that are comprised of landowners that represent different parts of the state and different interests in wildlife. And so those include everything from a white-tailed deer advisory committee to a mule deer committee to a breeder user group. We have held multiple stakeholder meetings with interests from the ranching, wildlife, and captive cervid community. We maintain a chronic wasting disease a task force that we co-host with the Animal Health Commission that's comprised of representatives, again, from the free-range wildlife interests, veterinarians, the breeder community, private landowners. We communicate very regularly with the state's largest landowner organizations that are very involved in wildlife issues, and by those I mean primarily the Texas Wildlife Association, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, Texas Forestry Association, and so forth. And so it's a major priority for us, Congressman, and we've worked diligently to try to earn their support and trust in our work on this issue.
Yep. As far as I know, there haven't been any cases of CWD found on federal land in Texas, has there?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
So from the map, as I recall, we've got a small area in central Texas. It's under a watch or surveillance.
Yes, sir.
And a small area up in the Panhandle.
Yes, sir.
And then over toward El Paso.
That's correct.
Have you heard of any other potential areas in Texas other than those three small areas?
Yeah, very good question. So one of our real priorities has been very active surveillance across the test. So we have really increased our sampling efforts really probably fivefold. From a free-range perspective, we'll collect and test upwards of 10,000 samples of deer on ranches, deer that are hunter-harvested, roadkill deer, and test those for chronic wasting disease. We also work with the captive cervid community to collect tests inside the breeder facilities to help, again, with an understanding of the distribution and prevalence across the state. Again, since 2012, with all of that surveillance, we have found it in those three areas, and clearly we want to keep them in those three areas.
Yeah, and just as a passing on a compliment from a while back after a hurricane knocked out much of the power in the southern part of my district, I was down there after midnight talking to the sheriff, and I said, the governor wants to know what you need. And he said, they've sent us some law enforcement. What we really need are game wardens. They can operate under any conditions, anywhere, anytime. if they could send us some game wardens, that would be invaluable. And a bunch of game wardens came, and it made all the difference there in Sabine County.
Thank you,
So
Congressman.
you guys know how to work. Mr. Summers, let me ask you, the federal government's response to CWD is divided between Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and the Department of Interior's U.S. Geological Survey. From a state perspective, and given your experience, what can the federal government do better to coordinate its response with both of those agencies?
Yeah, I think it's a better understanding of what our real priorities are, understanding how this disease is being spread across the landscape and the role and responsibility that each one of those agencies play. We've got a strong working relationship with staff within USGS in terms of what expertise and knowledge from disease management perspective do they bring to the table. And so I think they play an important role there. And then recognizing the role of confined cervids and the potential movement of this disease across the landscape and how we all collectively work together to address those known sources of risk, I think is really critical.
Okay, thank you very much. My time's expired.
Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Sumner, managing CWD seems like a case study in the saying an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There are some areas in the U.S. that have reached 50% prevalence of CWD. Every other deer has it when you reach that level. What are the management options when you reach that point?
Yeah, at this point, the tools available to us to manage the disease are extremely limited. And so biologists and ecologists from across the country have been starting to ask those questions of once the disease gets to extremely high prevalence where 1 in 2 adult bucks or maybe even 1 in 3 adult females are infected with the disease, how might hunter-harvest, how might some of these anthropogenic things that we're doing, feeding and baiting, concentration of animals, the role of the environment be playing in transmission of the disease. So it's a huge area of interest in terms of how might we manipulate hunter-harvest, our regulations, those human-based things that we're doing to slow the trajectory of the disease. Because in the absence of a cure and no vaccine, our hands are pretty much tied when it gets to that kind of prevalence.
And how do you identify land in the wild where infectious prions are known to exist? How's that identification process go? Can you?
So the primary mode of detection of the disease is through very intensive surveillance using hunter-harvested animals. We, as a state, target taxidermists, the known, as Dr. Schuler indicated, higher prevalence in adult males, that there appears to be a higher harvest vulnerability for those animals exhibiting some abnormal behavior. We have found that through consistent, continued sampling of those adult males within the population is a pretty effective means of detecting the disease. And it's important to note that we need to do that consistently through time so that we can detect the disease at a very early stage. And that's really the primary reason why we as a state have invested so much energy in testing.
And can you disinfect land in the wild where these infectious prions have been identified and known to exist?
Yeah, at this point in time, we have no known way of sterilizing an environment. There's been a number of efforts to do that, the amount of energy required to sterilize an environment. We just haven't identified how that might even happen.
At this point, you can't, right?
No, it's a huge gap in how we might deal with contamination.
And quickly, so coordination, resource attention, and public awareness and education at this point seem to be from what I gathered from all of you, seems to be the primary response that's being talked about today.
Yes, I would agree with that the need for research to define the known gaps, coordination, communication amongst entities, given that this disease spreads across the landscape, and then how do we effectively and efficiently communicate such a complicated topic with the public so that they can understand the true risk.
Dr. Schuler, is it possible for that CWD could jump from deer to elk or to other non-human species like great cat predators? Is there a version of CWA in cats?
So deer and elk both get CWD currently, and they can pass it back and forth between those mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk. As far as predators, there have been studies looking at coyotes and crows, and they found that those animals did not get infected, but they did shed prions that remained infectious in their feces. So they may be a source of spreading prions. There's a study that's been in progress in Colorado where mountain lions have been fed infected mule deer, and so that study hasn't been published yet, but it's my understanding that those cats are getting very old and they haven't seen any clinical signs in them yet. So right now we haven't seen it jump to cat species like we did with BSE in England, where there was a feline spongiform encephalopathy.
Mr. Pinhasohto, the CWA is an existential crisis for the hunting community. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is lack of understanding, and because they can't see it in a lot of cases, lack of belief that it's a problem. So it starts there. It starts with education and awareness and acceptance.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, as you know, I'm from Arizona, and we have a wonderful elk herd. We don't have any cases to date. But we have it from 3 neighboring states. Mr. Smith, what kind of recommendations would you have for Arizona in this situation?
Sure, and I'll confess that I'm not personally conversant on all the measures that Arizona has taken, but just conceptually, obviously prohibiting importation of live deer from neighboring states that are known to be infected with CWD would be a first recommendation if that hadn't already been done. Secondly, a prohibition on the movement of hunter-harvested carcasses into the state from CWD-positive states would be an important recommendation that, if they haven't already considered and enacted, I think would be prudent. And then, as we've talked about so much on this panel, the need for early detection. And so the investment in surveillance across the state to be able to detect the disease if it exists at a low prevalence, so that measures could be put in place to contain the disease and keep it from spreading. And so those would be the principal measures that I would recommend considering, again, if Arizona hadn't already done that.
Mr. Pinhasohto, some of the problems is that if the propensity is higher with males, most of the males stay away, they separate from the calves and cows and fawns. So they're kind of hard to kind of follow up. Is that part of the problem?
That actually presents a number of problems. One of them is our culture now, where it has become more common to allow younger bucks to live longer so that we have larger antlered animals to pursue, whether it be elk or deer. So now you've got that culture, and now we're asking people to maybe not let those deer be on the landscape as long because they are more susceptible. And as you said, they also spread the disease more effectively, I guess you could say, because they're dispersers. You have a yearling buck, for example, that is leaving his home range to establish a new one. That range 10, even 20 miles or more in some studies. So these are deer that are actively moving across the landscape, seeking out other deer to interact with. And now we're asking hunters potentially to take more of those deer off the landscape as opposed to leave them on. And that presents some real challenges, especially when you consider people have purchased land to manage for larger, older deer. A lot of times they've given up their life savings to do this, and now CWD has changed the game, and you can understand why they're quite upset about it.
So are there, like, a safari club and other groups, is there a mechanism where, you're utilizing the public, not getting them scared, but having them empowered in regards to, they're in the backcountry, hey, when I come back, I've noticed this herd in this area, something's weird about it. Is there something that can be coordinated from your aspect that could actually help?
I think education's a big part of it. We cannot deal with this disease without hunters. plain and simple. We need them to recognize things when they're out there, but we also need them to be shooting animals, providing samples, and participating in management, because there is no other feasible option to accomplish those things without hunters, so we need their leadership on this.
Well, I'm originally from western Wyoming, and I remember a year in which the quota wasn't taken of mule deer. And that year we had a very hard winter, and they starved to death, standing up. It was hard. It was hard to watch. Dr. Schuler, kind of want to go back to these studies. Now, I've been reading about the two studies, very different results. But one of the studies, they're injecting the prion into the brain of the monkey. That's not a normal pathogen, is it?
That's correct. That intracerebral injection is something that's been done in monkeys and domestic animal species to see if they will develop disease. So,
But it's not it's not a normal pathway.
No, absolutely not.
So you brought up a number of studies. Where are the studies, and how many of the studies are going?
So when we're talking about the macaque study, that is being done by a researcher in Canada, and the macaques are housed in Germany. The study is ongoing. There also was a study in macaques that's been completed in which none of the study animals developed signs of TSEs. The problem with these studies is they're very small numbers of animals, so we're trying to glean information from low numbers.
A little bit of liberty here for a second. One more question.
Absolutely.
So I guess, as prevalent as this disease is, where is our veterinarian community? Are any of those schools like Oklahoma, Colorado State, are they involved in those studies?
Yes, there are some very good research projects that have been done out of Colorado State. There are researchers in Michigan, in Wisconsin right now that are trying to follow up on these things, but the lack of funding for research has really hindered the academic community. And I'm based at a veterinary school, and the curricula around wildlife health is relatively limited related to domestic animals, and we're working to change that. But again, that's where veterinary education could really benefit from more investment for wildlife, along with the investment in diagnostic labs, so that we have the capacity to do the testing in the turnaround time that hunters really need and want, because a lot of the equipment that the diagnostic labs are not being supported by their companies anymore. The equipment is aging, and the support staff isn't necessarily there, because the bulk of our samples come in during the hunting season all at once, and we want a short turnaround time, and that's difficult to ramp up that quickly in such a short amount of time.
Well, it's very important to me. I have 60 of them, 60 elk that are in our neighborhood. So I want to make sure that they stay healthy. So anything on that forefront, we'd love to keep up on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grossart. And I will just begin another round of questions and recognize myself for another 5 minutes. And you've been covering it, but I just want to make sure, is that if chronic wasting disease does cross the species barrier, will people only be able to get it from eating contaminated meat like they did with mad cow disease, or are there other ways that people could become infected?
So eating contaminated meat is definitely one potential route if it were to cross the species barrier. But given that we don't know all the potential routes of transmission, we have to be concerned about other mechanisms. So with BSE in England, they have asked that people that were present in the UK during that outbreak not donate blood, because one of the things that we've seen is that these prion species actually adapt to their host. And so even if you have somebody who didn't necessarily eat infected venison, if they get a blood transfusion from somebody that did, and that prion goes from host to host, so this is called serial passage, where it goes from the same host to the next host. This is what happened with Kuru, another TSE in humans, where there was actually cannibalistic behavior. But there's concern about things like organ donation and blood transfusions, where you may have prions that are moved from human to human, and they could potentially adapt over time. We have not seen that, but it's something that the community is concerned about.
Thanks. And so if chronic wasting disease doesn't cross from, into humans, I guess it could potentially still cross the species barrier into other animals that are very important to our lives and certainly our economy. And for example, in my district, 21st Congressional District of California, dairy is one of the largest dairy districts in America. And if chronic wasting disease began infecting cows, it would be absolutely devastating. And so what is the risk of this could spread to cattle?
Again, we have very, very limited work in this area, but there has been some studies, particularly in Wyoming, where they housed domestic species in a research facility that was heavily contaminated with CWD, so they had natural interaction with wildlife species that were infected, and they did not see any natural transmission to those cows. So there appears to be a relatively good species barrier there. And again, it's whether these prion strains would be able to adapt to a different host, or if the route of exposure is oral through consumption of plants that may be different. And again, the genetic susceptibility of it, because these studies have been so limited, that variation in the prion coding gene may lend some animals to be more susceptible than others.
No, thanks so much. And, in my home state, California, we're very fortunate that CWD hasn't been detected yet. But as you pointed out, the disease can spread very quickly. And so, Mr. Summers and Mr. Smith, just from your testimony, I guess Missouri first detected its first case in 2010, Texas in 2012. And your state's been able to keep the prevalence of CWD very low. And one, how were you able to detect it early on? And how were you able to really keep the disease under control as much as possible? What actions do you think are most effective in keeping the prevalence low?
So in Missouri, as I indicated, first detection in captive facilities in 2010, the free-range herd was in 2011. We embarked on a pretty extensive and consistent surveillance program that began in 2002 and carried through. And the intent in the design of that surveillance was to try to detect the disease at a very low prevalence, if present. And so I think that allowed us to set the stage in which we found it in a small defined geographic area, and then working cooperatively with local landowners on areas where the disease had been detected to aggressively increase hunter harvest, including allowing exemptions for landowners and hunters on those properties during the hunting season to exceed their statewide bag limits, harvest additional bucks, as well as our postseason targeted culling efforts, which Illinois began in 2002, 2003 in response to finding CWD there, and had shown that through very aggressive management, additional follow-up, trying to remove those social groups, you can have some pretty significant impact on the prevalence of the disease locally. So we've been very aggressive in our surveillance, and then when we find it through the cooperation of landowners, been pretty successful in implementing postseason targeted culling.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, we'll come back to you, Mr. Smith, on my next round, but I want to recognize the gentleman from Arizona again. I beg your pardon. Yes.
There's two gentlemen here.
Yes. Yeah, Mr. Gosar.
Yeah,
thank you again.
Mr. Sumner, in Missouri, that's kind of an easier task just because you have a lot of private land, right?
I would argue that no, that's not necessarily an easier task because we are there at a guest of the landowner. We do not demand
I understand, but
access.
you don't have the impediments of game management processes like federal lands do, right?
That may be true in some states. We have had a very good working relationship with our federal partners in terms of collecting CWD samples. We have been able to collect some additional samples, actually, in fact, on National Wildlife Refuge land that's in Illinois that actually is on the Missouri side of the river, kind of a unique scenario. And so in our state, we do have very good cooperative working relationships, both with our partner land management agencies within the state, but also those that hold federal lands.
I guess my point is you compare Missouri versus Wyoming, a little different kind of concept on management and visual, surveillance of those herds. True?
Yes, I think that's true, and I think it gets back to the nature of the attachment to the land. In a private land ownership state, those individuals have a great investment in the animals that are using their property. I think we are definitely seeing a different public response to the disease where it's not necessarily in your backyard, and so we have landowners that are concerned because the disease is on the property that they've bought, that they've invested in, and they put great value in having those animals there and them being healthy.
Mr. Pinhasohto, with the influence of the hunting community on conservation, I mean, you look at the success of Ducks Unlimited, oh my God, that's one of the reasons we see the expanding bird activity. How can we involve the hunting community and have them work as collaborators, but also, still participate in the hunting field without causing undue scare, but get to accumulating the information that we need?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is keeping everybody on the same message. I think it's very important that we do not say more than we know on either side of the issue. We say what we know, we stick to that message, and we let the science guide us. And I think it's also, as part of the education process, hunting is, the traditions are very deep, okay? We're asking hunters, we have to recognize that we're asking hunters to change behaviors. The most hunted species, 70% of all hunters hunting deer, we're asking them to change those traditions in some ways in order to help us with this issue. So we have to recognize taking the white out of milk doesn't happen easily, okay? It's gonna take a while. This is I guess we call it a crock pot process and not a microwave process. So patience, but consistency of message, and also trying to avoid some of the rabble-rousing, I guess, that's out there. People that just simply say it's not an issue and it's all made up, and we deal with that as well, which is not helpful because, again, if you can't see it, it's very hard to believe it, especially if you don't want to believe it.
Gotcha. Dr. Schuler, I know that one of the cases that my dad actually was following, it was in southern Wyoming by a Point of Rocks. And it was a herd of about 30 elk. And in the late progressions of the disease, these animals become very stationary. Is that true?
So the CWD usually takes at least a year to develop the end-stage signs, the clinical signs that most people refer to, where the animal is emaciated, it might drool, its ears are drooping, and it might walk in circles. But prior to that, it is possible for these animals to move longer distances. And I've done field studies where I've actually tracked infected animals. I didn't know that they were necessarily infected until they were dead, and been surprised at how far they could move. So really, during that time, before they're showing clinical symptoms, they're moving around on the landscape, and they're able to shed prions in their saliva, their feces, and urine. So they are spreading disease around in that way, but it's not until the end stages where they're really in poor shape. And so in New York, we've asked that any clinically abnormal animals that are reported to the Department of Environmental Conservation actually are tested, that those are high priority to bring in and have them tested, because that's one of the best surveillance samples that we can get.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, you mentioned CWD was found in 5 captive white-tailed deer in their breeding facilities, and 3 of those have been depopulated and shut down. For the 2 that are still operating, how do you prevent CWD from leaving those particular facilities?
Sure.
What are the protocols? What happens?
Yes, sir. So both of those facilities are operating under a herd plan developed by the Texas Animal Health Commission, which is, again, our state veterinarian agency and the experts in animal disease. That herd plan that we are also a partner to stipulates very rigorous testing of the animals that are remaining in pens within those facilities. And if a animal within one of the pens in a facility, and so these facilities have multiple pens, is found to have chronic wasting disease, then all of the animals within that particular pen will be depopulated. In order to make sure that risk on the landscape is attenuated as much as reasonably possible, those facilities are also required to engage in antemortem testing or live animal testing. And so they conduct either a rectal or tonsillar biopsy, and there's a series of those tests over time that have to be conducted before the breeder facility is permitted to release deer onto an adjoining release site, which is a high fence site designed to keep those animals contained within that. In addition, those facilities are required to test hunter-harvested deer from the release sites associated from those captive facilities, so we get additional tests in those areas.
And the breeding facilities, the breeding business, for lack of a better word, now, there's probably a better way to explain that, but as stakeholders in this issue that we're all talking about, that I come to realize is a very serious issue. Their participation, their point of view, given that they have they have a interest in the well-being of the stock, but they also have a proprietary interest in terms of business. How does that work? And is it a legitimate partnership as you see it?
Well, it's a good question, and I guess what I would say in response to that question is, first, those deer, irrespective of how they're managed, whether it's in a captive cervid facility or in a free-range environment, still belong to the people of Texas, and so they are a public trust resource. And it is imperative that we all work together to help minimize the potential spread of that disease, and whether, again, it's in a captive cervid facility or in a free-range environment. And so it's in everybody's best interest to help do what we can to minimize the distribution or the increase in prevalence. We have worked very closely with the captive cervid community to increase testing within those facilities to make sure that deer, when they are moved into and out of those facilities, are not being moved as asymptomatic carriers of that disease and then inadvertently spreading that disease somewhere else. And again, that's in everybody's best interest to participate.
Yeah. One more question, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sumners, you mentioned an estimate of 7,000 to 15,000 animals that tested positive for CWD that are estimated to be consumed every year. This runs counter to the recommendations of CDC. And so the question is, and maybe you can or can't answer, why is this allowed to occur once they're identified as infectious?
Well, the recommendation from the CDC is that nobody would consume a known positive animal. And so given just the unknown risk of the potential for human transmission, the availability of testing, hunters' strong desire, growing desire because of that unknown human health risk to have animals tested has really changed some of the demands placed on state fish and wildlife agencies. Like I mentioned, hunters now have, or a growing number of them have that expectation, especially in areas where CWD exists, that states provide the opportunity for animals to be tested so that they could make an informed decision as to whether to consume those animals. So it stresses us as state agencies and the resources we have, the limited availability of testing facilities and that short time period that Dr. Schuler talked about is also a pretty significant challenge in meeting that demand.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. Thanks for welcoming Natural Resources Has-Been back here today. I appreciate it. I didn't leave the committee by choice. This is a great committee, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, especially on such an important topic of chronic wasting disease. I'm from Pennsylvania. I represent the Pennsylvania 15th Congressional District. This is an issue I've got very involved in. CWD is as it impacts cervids, is certainly a threat to our whitetail population. We have hotspots within Pennsylvania. I've got a constituent here, actually, who's been great to connect with in certain spots, and it's been interesting to look at the vectors that it travels, and I think we're learning a lot from it. But it poses a real threat. I looked at tourism dollars, let alone the heritage impact with the whitetail deer. And then in my district, we also have most of those approximately 1,300 elk, wild elk that are roaming, that are an amazing part of our tourism, and the potential, they're kind of communal, so the impact potentially to them just in a short period of time, a year or 2 years, should that CWD hit there. And so I know that the current, sort of the state of current management is that we do a lot of calling, but I really, we need more than that, and we need to go beyond that, actually. I look in 2018, Wildlife Services, APHIS, reported just recently to me as I researched this, not just Pennsylvania, but Michigan. In Michigan, they basically sampled, which means Wildlife Service went in and killed 349 deer. They found one case. In Illinois, they killed 99. They called it taking samples, and they found 2 cases. And in Pennsylvania, these USDA professionals came in and killed 163 deer and found 0. Now, there was a hunter that in the same herd that found one that tested positive. That's a total of 511. Well, there's a total of 3 cases of CWD we found, but the fact is the total universe, in the end, there were 511 dead deer. And I have no problems with dead deer. I just like my sportsmen to be able to shoot them, and not the USDA. And I have the greatest respect as someone who's has been a leader on the Agriculture Committee with USDA, and Wildlife Services in particular does a great job. But that's a management issue with our state game commissions who choose to use the wrong approaches, I think. So my question is where, and I apologize if I'm replowing old ground here, but where are we in terms of good research to be able to hopefully develop a live test, and us perhaps someday a vaccine that could be distributed in feeders, both for whitetail deer on farms, but those are out as well in the wild. Anyone going to take a shot at kind of the state of research on that?
They're all looking at me, so I guess I'll take that one. First, I'd like to address your numbers, if I may, just briefly. In a lot of these diseases that are of veterinary importance, depopulation is really the tool of choice. I mean, I mentioned earlier that 4.5 million cows were killed in the United Kingdom to stop BSE. And if it were tuberculosis or brucellosis or any other cervid disease, animal depopulation is what the veterinary recommendation would likely be. So 511 is a relatively small number given the population. In that respect, I completely agree that hunters should be a part of that, and that reducing the density, because in a lot of these places that you mentioned, population densities are already above what the target is for the environment and for stakeholder needs. So reducing the densities in those areas to really get a better handle on what the disease prevalence is gives us a lot of good information, and it also helps us manage the disease. So we definitely need hunters to be a part of that, and sometimes based on their hunters' needs, they don't necessarily want to take an excessive number of deer that we need to reduce the population density. With regard to the live animal test, there are live animal tests that currently exist, so you can take a biopsy of the tonsil, and I've personally done that, or you can take lymphoid tissue from the rectal area. Those tissues are still tested with the traditional immunohistochemistry or ELISA, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. Those tests have to be done in conjunction with the genotype of the animal to feel confident in that test. So those tests aren't really practical for wild, free-ranging animals because you have to have that animal in hand. If you had a a carcass side test that the hunter could do, which is what we hear a lot about, that would be great, but the tests that are currently available have to function in a laboratory, and they take very specialized equipment, and one of the things that we really don't want is either a false positive or a false negative. So having those live tests that we feel confident in are paramount, because having a positive test kicks in a whole bunch of agency actions, as you've heard from Mr. Sumners and Mr. Smith. So we need to be confident in those testing results. As far as a vaccine, again, that would work for confined animals potentially, but it would be very, very difficult to distribute to a free-ranging herbivore, and how you would get that distributed in a concentration where it would actually be effective would likely cost millions and millions of dollars. The unfortunate thing is, I would think that if a vaccine were possible, one would have been in the works already for either BSE or scrapie, because millions of animals have been culled from those diseases. So the fact that that domestic animal research has not yielded a vaccine makes me skeptical that we would find one for a prion disease that hasn't been developed already.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you so much. And we'll try another round if you have any more questions. But I did have one. I mean, and Dr. Schuler, and in fact, each one of you, what are the larger scale ecosystem ramifications of losing such large parts of the deer population?
I'll take a stab at that one first. You know, I think it's twofold. One is that they're a very important part of the system. You know, they're a prey species. They're a large herbivore. I think most importantly, especially in a private land-dominated state, the value that landowners place in having healthy deer and elk populations on their properties vests them in broader habitat management and conservation efforts. And so the loss of that, the loss of recreational opportunity, the loss of that value of wildlife habitat, I think could and potentially has unknown impacts onto our conservation heritage. The other side of it is that our current funding model is built on, as Carter mentioned, the goose that laid the golden egg, the white-tailed deer and the elk, is the primary driver of licensed dollars and revenue for state fish and wildlife agencies that then gets to be invested in broader conservation efforts. So I think those are the primary long-term bigger impacts of this disease.
I agree with that, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you so much. And certainly the economic effects of chronic wasting disease are so important, but as Mr. Pinhasohto was saying, is that we can't overlook the cultural implications that a diseased deer population can have on a region and communities in a country where hunting is just not recreation, but a way of life. I mean, I went out hunting myself for the first time when I was 13 years old, and it was pretty easy back then. You just, gut it out there, then, haul it back to the truck. But I wouldn't even begin to know how to start testing or take a sample for chronic wasting disease. And so, as you're saying, education is just so important there. But in your testimony, you described growing up hunting, and from my understanding, you even passed that tradition, or that convinced your vegetarian wife to hunt as well. I haven't been able to convince mine to go out yet, but I'd like your input on, what impacts, if CWD continues to spread at the rate it is, what impacts it could have on the next generation of hunters. And would hunting be, as a recreational sport and family tradition, be in jeopardy?
Short answer is yes. I mean, it's already in jeopardy without even talking about CWD. That's the scary part. We're now in a position where we're trying to save a hunting tradition, and now we've got this horrible dark cloud hanging over us at the same time. We've put in a lot of effort and a lot of money into bringing new hunters into the sport, retaining the hunters we have, bringing people back who may have hunted before. And that's hard enough to do as it is without this disease being there. So I think, to a point I made earlier, I think it is important that we re-engage hunters and tell them that how important they are to this issue. that they are leaders in this regard. They're leaders in wildlife conservation by the very fact that they do hunt. And it's not just the dollars generated, it is the traditions, and I can tell you, working in this field, you don't shake too many hands without running into the next person from Pennsylvania, for example, that has chosen this field or profession of wildlife management because they grew up with that tradition, because they were hunters. Like I said, when I grew up, I just assumed that everybody hunted. Everybody on my school bus hunted. That's all we talked about. We had school off on opening day. It wasn't, like I said, I got out into the real world and learned that it's only 5% that hunt. And we can't cut into that. Every percentage of hunters we lose from that 5% is a huge loss in dollars that we need very much to manage all wildlife. So for that reason, also, CWD is an issue for anybody that cares about wildlife, even beyond the disease, whether you're someone that loves songbirds or if you don't hunt at all, this disease matters to you.
Thank you so much. I'll yield the balance of my time. And Mr. Thompson, I'll recognize you for another 5 minutes if you like.
Chairman, thank you very much. I've got a question for Dr. Schuler, but let me say, first of all, I do have a piece of legislation that we've introduced. It's bipartisan. It would provide the $15 million towards research for chronic wasting disease. I'll be honestly with you, the calling that we do now, which I know is sort of the state of management, I think in retrospect, when we look back here, hopefully in a few years, we're going to associate that with the days when they treated disease with leeches. Because, you do lose your future generation of people in the outdoors. It's very frustrating when you have professional sharpshooters coming in and shooting these deer. That's less deer for the younger population to be able to have a successful experience hunting. And I recognize it's about research, and I wish I could take just 2% of what we've increased for NIH and have for animal health. And quite frankly, it's One Health today, right? It's animal health, human health, plant health. And so this authorization bill would provide up to $15 million for that research. Dr. Schuler, I do understand that Norway and South Korea were able to eliminate chronic wasting disease through a mass depopulation of animals and isolating the areas where the infected herds were found. Given the scale of CWD infections in North America compared to these countries, is there anything, given that seems to be the state of current management, that we can learn from their success?
Well, I completely agree with your sentiment that, for this disease, we have to kill the host to stop the disease, and that's very unfortunate, and none of us want that. Right. So that's why I'm a big proponent of the precautionary principle that, we can do preventative measures, and there are large swaths of the country that don't have CWD yet, and we need to make sure that people understand how they could get the disease and how to keep it out. So I am all for prevention rather than, immediately assuming that management is our only tool once it shows up there. As far as research and actions of other countries, I agree that $15 million is unlikely to be sufficient to do all the education and surveillance support that state agencies need, and support to diagnostic labs to get that turnaround time done. In talking about Norway, they eliminated an entire reindeer herd because they had detected CWD in those animals. And that was about 2,400 animals. So they took that herd out. They're leaving that ground fallow for 5 years. So I think it's a little bit too early to call that a success yet. That's still in progress to see what will happen. But the fact that they have ramped up their testing to 35,000 across the whole country, and that other Scandinavian countries are now paying attention to it. Norway is also very concerned that reindeer exports from that country, so the meat would be banned from the EU. And so I think they're taking a very proactive stance to try to eliminate CWD from that country. Similarly, with South Korea, they receive CWD from elk imported from Canada in captive facilities, and the best of my knowledge, they have not completely eliminated it, but that's something that I'd be happy to do a little bit more research on and get back to you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the witnesses again for being here today. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert the following documents into the record. First, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies' best management practices for the prevention, surveillance, and management of chronic wasting disease. Second, a letter from the State of Wisconsin's Department of Agriculture and Department of Natural Resources dated June 24, 2019, outlining areas of needed chronic wasting disease research. Hearing no objections, so ordered. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there are no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you again.